My brother just told me. Jay, why are we laughing so much? How many years, John?
I started teaching Hamlet when Lyndon Johnson was president.
And she says, I met the youthful Lord Paris at Lawrence Cell and gave him what becoming love I might, not overstepping the bounds of modesty.
No, I already did that with the other
I should
guy.
say not.
Him and Beowulf and...
But you know, when he dies, he's like desperate to be remembered. Tell my story. Remember me. Should we be doing this? Should we stop right now?
No. All right, welcome back to Teacher Talk. It's Paul and Jay. We've got a guest with us tonight. Mr. Chris Westrate's going to join in, and we'll get to know Chris. Chris, good to have you with us here tonight. Thanks for joining in.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris.
So we finished up our series on the Odyssey, and so we've covered all the books, and we thought we'd go through all 24 books again. No, just kidding. We're not going to do that. We are instead, we want to wrap up with a couple of episodes with some of our friends, our colleagues, peers who have done what we've done, who've given a lot of years over to teaching the Odyssey. And we thought it would be good to think about the Odyssey just simply in terms of teaching in class. So we'd like to tonight review our questions that we typically use of what's obvious and essential, what's subtle but crucial, and then what are those lingering questions or lingering points of awe that we find in the Odyssey, all from the perspective of teaching the book to high school students. So we want to look at it at that level. And so if some of you are on the sort of on the bubble about whether or not you want to teach the Odyssey, or you have those sort of natural questions like why should I? We'd like to cover some of those things from sort of a 30,000-foot view. So we invited Chris. When I think about teaching classics, teaching difficult books, and succeeding in getting students to actually read them, and that's the subtle part. I've visited lots of schools and seen their impressive book lists that have books on them that I know no high school kid has ever cracked and read more than a page or two of. So assigning books is one thing. Taking classes of kids through them, getting them to read them is another thing entirely. And so I want to talk with Chris. Jay and I both want to talk with Chris tonight about his experience in doing it, because he has a really unique background in doing this and a unique teaching situation. Chris, it was how many years did you teach in this tutorial model that you taught in? And tell us a little something about it. It's a unique little setup. What did you have going there?
I taught in something between a homeschool co-op and private school situation for 23 years. And it was mostly wonderful. A lot of parental support. A lot of commitment on the part of the kids once we could draw it out of them, I think. Was an a la carte model. So homeschooling families were coming to take a couple of subjects, maybe a day full of subjects. Sometimes it morphed into being 2/3 of their program. And so kids would come and do English classics with me and then do chemistry.
Yeah. Okay.
Move on to algebra 2 or whatever it was. So it was a fun model to work within because it felt, and the way we created it was to kind of model the collegiate model where you come for a couple of days for longer blocks and you have the assumption of the flipped classroom that the lion's share of the work is happening in the reading nook and in some of the journaling and writing that the kids are doing that they then bring to the seminar table or the Harkness table.
Right.
And so we had a lot of, I think we had a lot of great success with especially the humanities in that space. And so I loved it and taught. And when I was director for the last 10 years, I remained in the classroom, wanted to stay in the classroom. And I always said that if I was going to do Dumbledore, I had to, still teach.
Also cast the occasional spell. Yeah.
Yeah. But it was a lot of fun. And now I'm dissertating and finishing up a PhD, which I'm calling my midlife sabbatical. It's a lot of work, but for me, it's a sabbatical from teaching high schoolers. Sure. And not sure what's next, but I've been working with the dear students of UNH and really enjoying that as well and finding some of the same methodology to be equally successful in this space, which surprised me somewhat. So just what I'm
That's
doing right
interesting.
now.
But your work was oriented toward preserving the fact that these students were primarily homeschool students, right? So they came to you, you assigned work, you reviewed work, and then sent them off back to their little nooks, homes, worlds, wherever they were, to read, to write, to do some studying throughout the week. So you'd see them, what, twice a week?
Twice a week for an hour and a half was, I think, our best model. That
Yeah.
classic Tuesday, Thursday college schedule. Yep.
Perfect. Hour and a half, Tuesday, Thursday. So that's a really different setup than, traditional school, but there's lots of things you can do there and lots of experiences you've had, with using that model that I think will be really helpful for us. So you did English classes. What did you tend to teach? What was your book selection like?
I taught across the literature curriculum. So I did a British lit class, a couple of American classes. I tended to break it at Twain and kind of come into modernism for a whole year, modernism into contemporary. And then I did a classics course. I started classics at the 9th grade level just to kind of play with the idea that we would read some Homer and Aeschylus and Plato and then switch into the texts that were reliant on those foundations. And I found that those 9th graders, though I had a very precocious group the first year, and they did just fine, and they argued for it forever that I should have kept it. But I switched it to senior year because I think that so much more could happen with the human development that happens for most students by the time they get to senior year. And so I ended up going British, American classics. Okay. And so we definitely took a maximalist approach because we told them that it was a flipped classroom and that they were responsible for processing the curriculum before they came in. We read a lot. And so, when they got to senior year and they had done as much as they had, they would process Gilgamesh and Iliad and Odyssey within the first quarter.
Yeah.
Into Oresteia.
Yeah. So
we were able to do a ton. And so by the time we got to February, we were doing Divine Comedy and linking up all the mythology that we had.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
How many? I think I remember looking at your course lists over the years, and you would list the course by page numbers, a number of pages read. I think, if I remember that right. Yeah. Didn't you do that? Like, what was it?
I mean, it's been a while. I don't know. I mean, if you think about Iliad and Odyssey and Gilgamesh and the Agamemnon as one quarter, it would be times 4. Because we would especially towards the end of the year, we would go maximalist even for the younger guys. So we would read all of Moby Dick in March in the 19th century course.
So you were doing thousands. You were doing thousands of pages.
Thousands. Yeah. With that, there are pros and cons. Of course, you can text crawl, and that's a lot of fun if they're willing to go that, one episode per book of the Odyssey, like some guys I know. If they're willing to do it, then I think it's magical. But I also think that kind of, especially I was thinking about the Iliad in particular, because we were talking about the Odyssey. With the Iliad, it's so massive. I mean, it's like Moby Dick, or it's like Infinite Jest. It's something that has to pour over you until you're done with it. And then usually it's 4 a.m, because by the end, you got to find out whether the whale takes them or they take the whale. So with the Iliad, I always felt like it's felt so like a mountain that one can't climb. But I told the kids, just, you're never going to place all these names. There's cultural context that's gone.
Yeah.
But you've got thousands of people killed in various ways. And a lot of them have backstories that are really interesting, that help us understand Greek culture, and then, or that era, Greek culture. And then you have this overarching arc of themes that Homer is using, or whoever, all the way through. And that if you can track that, and you can stay on that wave, then when you get to Achilles giving over the body, there have been so many bodies, but this is the body that matters.
Yeah.
Just like Patroclus was the body that mattered.
Yeah.
Achilles' body is going to be the body that really matters.
Yeah.
So, and the students, when they were freed up from having to come in and give a report on poor renditions of drawings of whales, they were definitely able to kind of get the gist of all the encyclopedic stuff.
Yeah.
And also begin to ask some of the deeper philosophical questions about determinism.
Right. How do you think your students did on, I mean, it's a broad ranging question, but on reading through all those pages? That's a lot. And a lot of teachers listening to this, I mean, that's probably the first thing that comes to mind. You have students dialing in at all different points and different levels, but I think it's got to be our first, it's my
in different
obsession
schools,
this year.
sorry, Paul, in different structures of what a school day is.
Yes. Yeah.
For sure.
All of
Yeah,
that. But there's a common thread, through, I would think, just about any setup you could arrange of at some point a student's got to sit down and read. Like, they've got to sit down and read. I don't know, how do they do, or what did you do to improve that percentage, of reading pages, or did you think about it that way?
I think that because it was a great books model with a lot of freedom and with a lot of assumed work time outside, and with parents as teachers and administrators making sure it got done on some level, because that definitely happened, maybe more than in some other contexts.
Yeah.
I'm kind of that parent too, but I think that model worked in that space. I didn't impose it on my UNH students when I did Lit Survey. We didn't read as many pages, though I did force them to read book 6 of the Iliad as the preparatory poetry before we got to the romantics,
Yeah.
And so I did ask them to do some of that hard work and to wrestle through some of it. But they have, a number of other major subjects, and some of them are heavy reading and heavy memorization. So, I think you tailor. There is no one perfect model. It was just a delightful model to work within that I would absolutely return to. And if I were teaching graduate level courses, I would go back to that mentality, go at a slightly different level with some critical and theoretical stuff along with. But I think it worked well. And I wouldn't recommend to teachers out there that you go maximalist necessarily. But I would say that I've heard over and over again from students, from homeschool, from public school, from college students, that they don't want to beat a thing to death.
Yeah.
And that if they're not doing a graduate level course on Homer where you are beating it to death for that is the purpose. If you're not doing that, then they want to move at a steady enough clip that they stay interested. And I think that bears listening to. I was that public school student through my high school, and I would read all night every night and not really sleep, and then come to English class and be reading something else because we were still on Act 2 of Romeo and Juliet. And it would bother me. And so I get that from experience all those years ago, but I also get it from students saying the same thing, and college students saying the same thing. Please don't text crawl too much for a general course.
It's a tough thing. I remember, Jay, the last years you and I worked together, one of our colleagues went after this. You remember that? And he tried to get us to do surveys of students at the end of the year to see what our actual reading, after everything was off the table, grades were in, transcript items weren't going to be affected.
Yeah, kids would honestly say, like, what percentage of the pages did you actually read?
Yeah. Right.
I was gonna say too, if I can just interject something related. It's funny. Just had this conversation with a new colleague today about this very thing you're talking about, Christopher. The deep dive versus moving a little more quickly. And I think, as we all know, the complexity increases when you have tracked classes. And then I have a critical mass of students who get to school at 7:30 a.m. and don't leave till 5:30. Then they have probably 7 p.m. to whenever they go to bed to do 6 subjects of homework. So
if they're not doing sports or drama or whatever else.
Well, that would be after school till 5:30, but you're right. But I'm with you that I find myself I teach I have freshmen who struggle, and then I have AP seniors, and I love the split. I love it.
It's fun.
But with both sections, particularly the seniors, I find myself wrestling with saying, go home and read this block. We're doing Pride and Prejudice now. Go home and read this block. And I've gone to enough professional development workshops about learning styles and social emotional wellness, and all good things in and of themselves. But I find that I can use all those things in some part of my brain to require less. And I don't want to make it punitive. And I don't hear that in you either.
Yeah.
So it's that sweet spot, right? If you look at the kids in front of you and you figure out, like you just mentioned, UNH, their lives are different, they're different, so you've calibrated. And I think for teachers listening to this, I think that's the magical, I don't know. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts, Christopher, about dialogues you've had with other people you've worked with about just that conversation. Because I don't think there's lots of agreement among teachers. I mean, I think there's lots of ways to do this gig, and there's very little agreement, even within individual departments, about the right way to do it. So how have you managed sort of your approach with colleagues that you have to work with?
Yeah.
So a couple of things, just going back for a second to answer another question, and then I will come back to that for sure. I would also ask them, honor bright, what percentage do you read? And I would give them a reading grade, and they tended to be really honest about it. So I did get, some 60%, but I also got a lot of in the 90s. Okay. And so that was thrilling.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the end of the world, so.
Yeah.
When I was doing administrative and teaching teachers, I would have, I think I would fall back on my own basic pedagogy. And that's that whatever you're teaching, you are working in synergy with other human beings, with other experiences, capacities, interests. And so, it's not a matter of what's the right number of pages, or how quickly should you finish the Iliad, or should you read an unabridged Iliad. Yeah. I think that the question is, what are these students in this moment capable of? And that's loaded, you know. And some of it is being a realist. What is their actual capacity to become interested in this if we shove too much down the throat? And so there were times when I would back way off, or just let's slow down on this syllabus. It's all written, but it's a living syllabus. So doctoring it all the time. That's one of the big things that I always do, is an online living syllabus rather than
I love that.
This is due for each day.
Yeah.
I love that.
So after every class, we rethink.
Christopher, I'm stealing that phrase, so I'll give you full credit with an MLA citation.
Yeah, Jay, I thought of you. Like you're sitting in front of Mr. Living Syllabus over here. This guy never does the same thing twice.
So I think it's education is relational.
Yeah.
And Freire talked about the banking model and how terrible it is, and we used to talk about just the sort of the empty vessel that we would pour something into, and how bogus that is. But it's the same concept. Right. I think at the end of the day, it's just, who are we dealing with? One of my last classics courses that I taught in that context, I got to the end of reading the Oedipus plays, and I said, okay, there is a third tragedian, but are you done? Yeah. And this one wonderful student said, go big or go home. We're doing Euripides.
Yeah. Nice.
And so we did, I think, Medea.
Right.
But it was great. And I loved that Riley said it, and then the rest of the class accepted that Westrate and Riley were on the same page. That this was a great idea. Yeah. And accepted it and did it and read it. And it was an average of, 90% of the pages read across the class, right? Yeah. When I got back the sheet. But if they had all said, I think we really need a break to do some writing. Yeah. I would have switched to that.
Yeah. Yep.
The other thing that I do a lot of the time, as often as I can, actually, is to give them choices.
Yeah.
So as much as I can, I will say, here are two ancient plays. Here's the rundown. Which would you like to do? And once they've chosen to do it, I read a bunch of rhetorical analysis papers for my UNH students. Mm-hmm. And 60% of them, in their afterthought that they wrote, I'm so happy that you allowed us to choose any argument that we wanted, from Pericles to Taylor Swift. Yeah. Because it made it really fun, and I did what I wanted to do, and I feel proud of this. Yeah. And I think that as often as that can happen, it's better. It's humanizing, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's just like a natural, playing out of that part you're saying of that you're teaching live people in front of you, and if you're stuck to this dead syllabus, or you feel like you owe the syllabus, or something else, that you get through all the pages and aren't connected with the students in front of you. Absolutely. You may as well not even be there. You just
Well, I remember Christopher. When my son was a senior a couple of years ago, he was a decent student, not mega passionate, but he did his work. Similarly, argument paper, but you could pick whatever argument. Very passionate musician, and he wrote like a 7-page rhetorical analysis of why Stevie Wonder's Songs in the Key of Life is the best album ever. And his teacher really believed it was a different Stevie Wonder album, and they had it out in class. Like,
yeah.
my son was ready to throw down. I mean, he really was, you know.
I love it.
But he
What a
would
great
never,
topic.
he would never have me read his papers because, of course, as an English teacher, what could I know?
Yeah.
But his teacher was a colleague of mine, and it's like it's what you're saying. It's funny when they have ownership. Even the writing and the grammar and the punctuation is better because they care on a different level. I think good students care about being good students regardless. But it's funny. I just have one more question, Paul. I find that with in a sort of traditional school setting, when I talk to teachers about the teaching of writers like Homer, Shakespeare, Dickens, Austen, that it feels like the canonical nature of the texts can trick us teachers into thinking that the assignments have to be really boring. And I find that weirdly, these books are alive in so many different ways that the opposite is true. And I just think we collectively need reminding of that sometimes. Does that make sense? Like, I definitely want my students to write close reading papers. I'm never giving that up. But
Right.
I mean, there's infinite possibilities. And what you're saying about seeing a choice, you don't hear that a lot, actually, in high schools. You know, because teachers have to come together in a meeting and say, we're doing this. So,
And all agree. Yeah.
which
As
we don't
opposed
do.
to-
When did teachers ever agree? We're the worst.
Yeah. Never.
that's a bad model. I mean,
It is.
and I get the fact that they want to make sure that various students across these sections are not upset that they get something so profoundly different.
Yeah.
But within a particular class of students with a particular set of life issues at any given moment, there will be a need to course correct that you can't impose on your colleagues. So
Yeah.
there's that too.
Yeah.
Can I do a little show and tell? This is kind of fun.
Yeah.
What do you
And
got?
again, I would say, okay, you guys I made them write a lot. So they probably wrote 10 papers a year, probably.
Okay. That's a lot. That's a lot of papers.
And they weren't super long, but
Still.
3 to 5, you know.
Yeah.
They wrote a lot.
Right.
And so there were moments where I'd say, we're going to do something different. We're going to try to dive into this text in a different way. And so, for instance, this one is it's related. This is my student's version of Achilles' shield,
Nice.
and it is not accurate to the Iliad,
That's the best paper I've ever seen.
but it is pretty awesome. And it was born out of me saying, okay, you guys don't want to write, you know, a new critical paper at this point.
Yeah.
You want to do something else. And so I said, well, okay, projects, do something that gives a picture. And you know, most people who read the Iliad may or may not remember the shield, but it's pretty important.
It's
And
amazing.
those kids will never forget the shield.
Mhm.
And so we got to Purgatorio, and this is something I did annually, actually. We got to Purgatorio, and I said, you know, no paper on this canticle. You're going to bake me a 7-story mountain cake. And they would come in.
Parents
with
must
their
have
various
loved you. Parents loved you, Christopher.
They would get together, and
Okay.
some knew fondant and some didn't, and some were a real mess and some weren't. But they would bring these monstrosities with, like, you know, Beatrice as a Barbie doll on top. And you know what? They never would have remembered Dante's heavenly girlfriend
Yeah.
if they hadn't done that, because they would have read it and forgotten it.
Yeah.
A lot of times where I would just say, well, you know, let's do something totally different. And a lot of times it was spontaneous and it became something really cool that they remember and I remember.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
awesome.
That's fantastic. And I think that overall thing of just getting off the shoulda, you know, if you feel the obligation, if you feel like you owe the great conversation or you owe the tradition, or as Jay, as you're saying, all the way down to you owe your colleagues that you all have to be on the same page and move in the same way. That kind of stuff is just so artificial. And some teachers are in those circumstances. You don't even have the power at some level. Some level, none of us do. But as much as you can, I think, as much as you can, one, find out what their capacity is. Chris, you said that, you know, you're trying to find out what their capacity is. And then meet them. I say this to my colleagues. I'm trying to meet them where they are and take them to the next step. whatever that is, finding it, it's dicey. What's the next step? What can I take them to? That's my capacity, all of that. But that's sort of the dynamic, the layout of the push. And so that probably has a page number, of writing, a page number of reading.
Right.
And sometimes it's, make a cake, do a diorama, get off the paper, but with the point of drawing them in, with the point of that motivated, with Jay, your example, the motivated reading, the motivated writing is 1,000% different. Your son probably wrote the best essay of his life, there. And it wasn't really taught to him, right? Probably the best parts of the essay weren't things he learned in class. It was what was facilitated by his teacher then.
Yeah.
Hey, that's
Can
nice.
administrators
What's that?
Can administrators become comfortable with a system, a fundamental assumption of trust with the teachers that they hire?
Yeah.
That there is enough flexibility to facilitate well.
Yeah.
Or are they truly in the mode of checking boxes?
Yeah.
And if they are, then that's trouble. There's going to create conflicts within the department and within the school, and teachers are going to feel like they have to hide the good things they're doing.
Right.
Bad scenario.
That's bad.
Well, I think there's a happy medium too, that they're clearly, if the three of us were teaching, say, a particular level of, say, freshman English, it wouldn't be fair for me to teach, 8 papers a quarter and Paul to do 4 dioramas. So I think administration justifiably, and that's so Paul's style, if you know Paul. But Paul's diorama, he hasn't read a page of correcting since 1989. I don't know if you know that.
Guys,
He's
you're doing it wrong.
Some people do flip classroom. He's the diorama classroom. He can't even walk in his classroom. There's just dioramas there. No, so, I think you could, if the three of us were teaching, we could say, we've agreed that there's going to be roughly this much writing in a quarter. But there's going to be some assignments, and we've come up with this list of creative options that kids will pick from. But here's the menu we're giving them.
Right.
So I find that there's a lot of contention, like between the boots on the ground teachers and the administration doing a job that you couldn't pay me to do, frankly.
Yeah.
And I think they're looking for equity. And I don't know if we're always great at explaining what happens in the room. And some of it, Christopher, I think you're intimating, which is true, is it's not predictable all the time. Yeah. And I think administrators like systems. And I don't think we go into teaching. Right. I don't think we go into teaching teenagers because we like predictability. That would be a really dumb choice.
Right.
And
I think you just cannot believe until you've spent, as Chris just reminded us, 23 years in front of a certain kind of body of students. You can't believe the amount of variety, and at the administrative level, you just think, well, it's 9th grade English. Come on. How different can it be? Just do it, just show up and do it. But if you're really paying attention, and that just about covers it all as far as I'm concerned. If you're paying attention, literally think about that, paying attention. You cannot pay attention close enough. Then, the variety, the needs, moment to moment, class to class are enormous, especially if you're hanging on to that goal of motivated learning, to use what we're kind of saying here today. So it's my favorite. Jay, I learned this at when I was teaching with you. My favorite Catholic social teaching. I didn't know this word before, but it's subsidiarity. It's my favorite teaching from Catholic.
We're good at making up words.
That is my favorite made-up word. I don't even believe it's a real word, but I like the concept. I even looked it up and everything, went into it. But doing this idea of doing everything on as small a scale as possible, and not all things for justice. Like if you're looking for equity and justice, actually, that's the way you have the best chance of getting it. Is manage everything, enact everything as close to the thing being done as it can possibly be. And there's a difference depending on what you're doing. But the further away you get from the students and from the classroom, from the people who are working in there, less likely it is to be all the things you would use to describe good, all the elements that make that classroom good. So I love that. Wait, let's get into our introduction. Went kind of long. Let's see if we can hit our 3 questions. Chris, I'd like to throw those at you and get you digging into that. If you're teaching the classics, we did the Odyssey. I know you've done the Iliad and other texts, so we can cast this net a little more broadly if we need to.
Maybe like Homer, Paul. Just Homer.
How about? Yeah, sure. Like what's obvious and essential? If you're pitching this, how would you answer that question? Obviously you're teaching the classics because what? Why?
Yeah. Well, in teaching the Odyssey in particular, and especially after teaching the Iliad, so having that shared knowledge behind us, I think was really helpful. The Iliad is just classically tragic. And though the dead body isn't on the stage at the end, a representative one is. And there's a fire coming up from the city. So, Achilles and the city are going to burn. And so we're already there. And in fact, we've already seen Achilles killed in the armor of Patroclus, that Patroclus wears.
Yeah.
We've already seen the death scene before.
Right.
It's anticipatory. It's really powerful. And so you've got this kind of tragic without the actual death at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And with the Odyssey, I think it's super obvious, but it's not something that I think about until I pick it up again and look at it again. It starts with the gods getting together and bemoaning the death of Agamemnon and kind of how unjust the humans are. They blame the gods. Blah, blah, blah. But probably more importantly, Athena's like, hey, what about Odysseus? And Zeus says, yeah, I've been thinking about that.
How do you mention that?
Yeah, let's take care of that poor guy. And I guess what I like about the Odyssey, and this thesis is simplistic. I think that it's fraught with problems, but I'm going to throw it out there anyway. Sure. That I think the really obvious is that for a clever, likable, sometimes protagonist, the gods eventually mean well, and they're going to get him home, and he will succeed in his cycle of returning to hearth and home and wife and setting things straight in his own home, as was set straight in Troy. Anyway, something to think about. And so, I think for me, what's sort of obvious about it is its consolation. The Iliad is so bleak. And beautiful. It's gorgeous, but it's bleak. It is the dark waters. Yeah. It is the bloodshed on the shore. It is the promised death at the center of the whole thing. It is mean guys treating each other mean by taking their significant others. More on that in a minute, because that's fraught with all kinds of problems. Right. But with the Odyssey, we can talk a lot about trauma, I think. Mm-hmm. And I love that. I love that reading of the Odyssey, the sort of the traumatized Odysseus. And I think it's there. We can talk about, the sort of this concept of the dream of the man. And that's not encouraging in terms of robust personhood. And we can talk about, kind of what has to happen to get back your house and how horrific that is. And all that matters, I think. But at the end of the day, the wisdom goddess thought that he needed to get home, and for good reason, because Telemachus needs a dad. Yeah. And Penelope does not want to fall into whatever that's going to be. And things are set to rights. And so there's this weird comedic aspect to it. And I think it's worth mentioning the obvious happy ending, in a way, with caveats.
Yeah.
No, that's good. Yeah. I mean, that's good, especially if you're choosing amongst Homeric tales to read or near contemporary stories. There's a lot of darkness out there, a lot of difficult tales. And you're right, there's a fine consolation in this story, and something sort of classically comedic in that returning back to the state in which the story began.
It's like the scale is the same, but it's tilted the other way. We're still bleak, and we're still lost, and we're still, the slave of this nymph and all this. But it's tipped. It's going to be okay, and the Iliad is not going to be okay.
I find that one of the interesting things is most people that teach English in the high school classroom studied English, which means many of them will have graduated college without ever reading Homer. If they didn't go to a particular high school, they didn't read it. And you're not going to read it most likely in an English literature curriculum unless you poke your head into great books or a classics in translation class, but you don't have to read it. Can I ask a dovetail question, Paul?
Yes. Yeah. Please.
What if someone was required to teach this and didn't automatically love this kind of book? But, I think all of us, if we had our own children in school, the last thing we would want is for the teacher to teach difficult books like it's medicine, take it, it's good for you. Yeah. And I think so often that's how authors like Homer and Shakespeare are taught. And I think if you teach seniors at a school where they've had various teachers, you can almost tell who they have for teachers because they'll love certain things. Oh yeah, I know your sophomore teacher loves X. But same thing with, with the opposite. So, we could probably have a 24-hour conversation on all the reasons to teach it. And I love what you said. I think there's some weirdly hopeful stuff at the end of the Iliad with the Priam Achilles moments that are just so breathtakingly beautiful. And there's also some like weird complexity at the end of the Odyssey where the body count's insane and only a hand of a goddess stops the killing. But I love that answer that there's like hope at the end of both.
Yeah.
And hope not easily bought. I mean, it's not a trite hope, it's a hard-earned hope. But what would you say, hope it's okay to ask, what would you say if you were an administrator or a veteran colleague in a department and someone said, geez, I have to teach Homer and I have very little experience with stuff like this. I'm not super comfortable. And there's obviously a million resources, but I guess I'm talking on the level of passion.
Yeah.
It's good.
Well, I mean, as an administrator, I would and did say in some of those moments, so there's the students and there's their capacity. And then there's the teacher and that person's capacity.
Yeah.
And if they're going to do a much better job with two novellas that they love over the Odyssey, then I would want them not to force themselves into that mold. Well, I would want them not to force themselves into that mold that semester. But I would, I believe in professional development, not as learning about human development, learning about kids, learning about adolescents, and learning about teaching styles, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that stuff is great. But also, keep reading, keep investing.
Yes.
You don't feel capable of doing the Odyssey all the way up, to use Hemingway's line, this time? Okay. Well, in a year, I want to at least hear that you've read it.
Yeah.
And that you have reasons related to your connection or lack thereof with the text.
I love that.
So all right, your professional development is to go read the Odyssey.
Yeah.
Or just listen to it.
I wish you were my principal, Christopher.
It was kind of fun to be able to, because people would be all worried. You teach the Brothers Karamazov to juniors and seniors, and I'm doing one of your blocks, and I don't want to do that. And I'd say, you want to do Crime and Punishment? They'd say, I love it. Let's do it. Yeah. And they do Crime and Punishment, and that was that. And, again, eventually, actually, I was at a party with that same teacher who was one of my students and then had become one of my teachers at the end, which was super fun. And he was doing Brothers Karamazov, is doing it right now with some of his students.
Nice. Wow.
So that kind of thing, again, there's time to grow. We all have to fill in our holes, and I'm almost 50 and I'm still filling in holes all the time. That's why I'm in the graduate program,
Let me push Jay's twist on that question just a little bit too, which is, it sounds like you're committed to teaching the Odyssey. What's obvious, or let's say Homer or classics? So reaching just a little more broadly, because this obviously cannot be assumed. What's obvious and essential about teaching these books like the Odyssey and the Iliad? How do you deal with that? A lot of people don't do it,
Can we say books through the 19th century that are considered?
Go ahead.
The classics or the canon?
Yeah.
Let me preface that by saying I'm all for making sure, various authors who would not have found a place in the earlier canon make their way in here and there. Yeah, for sure. I'm a Baldwin scholar. I love teaching Toni Morrison. I love stretching the canon, and I'm all for that project.
Yeah.
What I'm against is the assumption that because there was a lack of balance, that these great texts are limited, biased, sure. But they are the idea that we need to push all of this out and read only contemporary, politically comfortable texts makes me really uncomfortable. Yeah. And I go back to something I think that there's a preface to Athanasius the Great's, one of his works, where C.S. Lewis writes about the power of texts from another time to force us to think critically outside of our boxes that are really comfortable for us.
Yeah.
And those can be whatever boxes they are. We're a very divided society right now, and there are different boxes, and everybody needs to think outside of their boxes.
Right.
Yeah.
If we want to have, a functional future.
Yeah.
Therefore, texts from the past powerfully force us out of that mentality and out of those comfort zones Lewis says, if there were texts from the future, I would advocate for those, but we don't have those. All we have is the sports almanac that came back in a DeLorean. I don't know. So, and I like that. I like that argument.
Yeah.
We're not preferencing the past. We're saying we only have texts from the past that force us to rethink our contemporary assumptions.
Yeah.
Now, why these books too? I mean, I think there is there's an old-fashioned argument that I still hold to, that they have survived the weather of time, and that matters. So the cantors who were doing dactylic hexameter in your watering holes on these islands, putting together what was the redacted Homeric corpus.
Yeah.
Man, I mean, that it was trial and error. It was it's kind of like a stand-up routine. You go and you give the jokes, and half of them work, and the ones that didn't, you move out of you're out of your repertoire until you have, your stand-up routine that's going to work at least for a couple months in this cultural moment. And I think that the process of performance, I mean, especially for this, and I think for Homer, for the tragedians, for Shakespeare and drama in general, you had to get the buy-in of an audience. And if the buy-in was King Lear worthy, then we're still going to be reading it now. Right. And if the buy-in was, I don't know, Tragedy of Miriam worthy, we'll read it as kind of this is interesting on the side. And I recommend that we read it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Tragedy of Miriam, it's really interesting. But it doesn't have the same weight dramatically or as a work of written literature as the Tragedy of King Lear. I don't think. So, yeah.
That's good. That's good.
I find the dialogue about this too. I find with whether it's in my department or you go to conferences and you're around a wider diversity of people, that they're not just two groups, but if you are to make two groups, I love the canon, we should keep doing it, and I only want to read contemporary Caribbean literature written in the last 24 hours, and that's all I want. Obviously there's nuance between those, but I find that when the two groups talk to each other, they attempt it with argument, which I think is a natural instinctive choice. But part of me thinks that the best argument for teaching something like the Odyssey is bring colleagues in to a group of average students. I never want to use best students to argue anything because that's a loaded argument. Average kids, whatever that means, you put them in a circle and they've done some writing and they're going to sit around and talk about the first 4 chapters of the Telemachy and watch them approach it from like a billion different angles, because to me, that's one of the things that defines a classic is an infinite number of approaches work, And I love what you said, the Lewis quote. I remember that quote. It's awesome. And just in a world where so few people see reading as an adventure, how amazing an adventure can this be for my life if something 3,000 years ago can remind me of my uncle or my grandfather who fought in the Vietnam War or a breakup or name a thing, whatever it is. Yeah. And I get argumentative. I'm my mother's kid, so I want to argue my way. And I think if we're trained in philosophy, like you're trained that's the most respectful way to go about this. But I almost feel like showing is better, almost like a creative writing mindset. Like, here's this in a room. Come watch this.
Yes.
And I also think reading it dynamically, you were alluding to the drama piece, doing Shakespeare. I mean, one of the challenges of getting kids to read Shakespeare is it's like a tooth extraction in iambic pentameter sometimes. So just getting them to like work on performance aspects of it. But I think these books read well and then given space for them to think and create, and then you sit around and have conversations. Like I don't find the Odyssey that hard to sell.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's other things I do. I'm not the best teacher in the world by any means, but I don't think this is that hard to sell. The kids that I teach struggle, but they get the sense this is like a real serious thing. Serious people have done it. I'm now a part of this community, and I kind of love that for them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And, I remember kids saying they look at Marvel movies differently. And I think I told Paul this story. The most heartening moment a couple of years ago, I had this young boy. He and his brother were adopted. Really rough situation. They were foster kids. So they do a short paper every 4 chapters for me, and we sit around and talk. And, kids are talking about Telemachus and Penelope and Athena. His whole paper was, how does he know that he even wants to know his dad? Because not all dads are worth knowing. and thinking what Odysseus has been through, maybe he's not worth knowing. Now,
Yeah.
Christopher, I had a good dad. I never thought of that. And this kid was reading on a level I wasn't reading.
Yeah.
So I just think, I'm sorry to go on and on, but I just think
No.
the best argument sometimes for reading old, difficult books that we think are worth reading isn't arguing. It's like,
Yeah.
if we could, like, bring people to the room and be like, watch these kids get excited and fight over this stuff. It's great.
I started doing that, Jay. I started video recording some discussions and not making them public in any way, but I just couldn't believe it. It was just shocking. Like I tell my students this, and I think it's true. I don't think I'm kidding myself. I said, if this book did not work, if the Odyssey didn't work, I would not teach it. But on average, over the years,
it would be torture, Paul. If it didn't work, you're there for a while.
I wouldn't do it. I would not do it.
Yeah.
And what you described that can happen in the middle, or even, Jay, you said you have those lower level freshmen who struggle with reading, putting the Odyssey in front of them, and then moving it right up to your AP students. If you taught them in their senior year, 12th grade AP, I know you did 12th grade with this, Christopher, sometimes too. The same thing happens. They find 1,000 different angles to come at the book. And if you're open to it, you'll find more and more you never saw, as you were saying, Jay, and it's across the board. Your high level readers and the ones you really can't believe it, but the low level readers the same. And you're right. You just have to see it. And I think, it wins you over. So that's how I got to Harkness discussions. I could not believe Harkness could work, but do it. Sit back, do it. Just watch it. Do it. That's all you need. You don't need to read that great little essay on Substack, about Harknessing or something, like just watch it.
Jay's example is so, I think, powerful, because it's the teacher trusting the students to bring genuine human experience to the reading, and the students feeling that they have that trust and can say those things.
Yeah.
And then when that gets said, you have to ask yourself, well, what is Odysseus like? How did he treat that, disabled person on the beach in the Iliad?
Yeah.
What about other fathers in this text? Oh yeah, Agamemnon killed Iphigenia to be able to even get out. No wonder Clytemnestra's so angry.
Yeah.
I don't blame him.
What a jerk. And he brings home Cassandra as a sex slave. That stinks.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you start to see, and what's Father Zeus like? He's crummy too sometimes.
That's right.
And all of a sudden we're dealing with some pretty bad dads. And
Right.
that's such a great comment, because it can open.
And you recognize that, like you're saying, Christopher. I think, Jay, you probably took you some part of a second to recognize the authenticity of that question.
Oh my God.
You just recognized immediately. This guy's reading. He's bringing his life experience. Not hard for you to imagine what might have been going through his mind when he made that observation.
No,
and it's so true. And it's not foreign to the text. To Telemachus, as much as says it. They say he's my father. I don't know. I never met the man. It's a kind of cheeky line.
Right. Man. I don't know of any particular conversation that doesn't live inside this book.
Yeah. That's
like Hamlet might be the other book like that in my head off the top of my that we teach, that is taught often in high schools. I'm sure there's a lot, but but there's just technology. Ecology. There's a new book coming out called Odysseus in Green, and it's about like the Iliad and the Odyssey's relationship to the environment.
Yeah.
Literally everything lives here.
Let's move. That's the intro plus question one. I'll move us toward the end.
Christopher, do you have to work tomorrow? We're just wondering. Do you have to?
I don't have to be in until noon, actually.
Oh, you heard him.
Gosh, please. Well, my alarm goes off at 5:15.
You're
trying to answer quickly.
Well, let's go. Question two. What's subtle? Christopher, you've done this. You've spent a lot of time with Homer with these classics. What's subtle but crucial that people who need to teach these classics or are teaching these classics might miss because they haven't done it as many times with in the contexts that you've taught it? What's something you can point our attention to that's subtle but really important in teaching these classics?
I do like to underscore the character issues in Odysseus himself, and character and character, right? He gets his moniker, he's the clever one. He's the one who can design the wooden horse and the way to kind of break the code. But at the same time, he loses everybody. He isn't as successful as he makes himself out to be. And some of those losses are very much his fault and his hubris, one might say, that lead to that. So, I think that's worth looking at. And I think the other thing that I like to think about relative to Odysseus as not a kind of standard Homeric hero in a way, almost as a correction to the Iliad, although I could argue this the other way too, but just for fun.
Sure.
It's the Odysseus who kind of gets what's coming to him in a number of different ways. And so he's sneaky and he tries to take advantage of people all the time. And then a whole bunch of people want to take advantage of them by basically eating them. There are a bunch of examples of that. And they will use the leverage that they have, those creatures, the Cyclops or Scylla, but also the humans. The first thing he does after he leaves Troy is to go and sack a city and kill and take the women as slaves. Well, okay. Yeah. So there's that. Well, that's also what the Iliad is spending a lot of time on from beginning to end. Mm-hmm. Agamemnon is angry and he's frustrated with a number of different levels. And the way he's going to solve this for himself is shows who's boss and, Blue Lobster it. And he's going to take Briseis. And it turns out that Achilles may actually really like Briseis. And poor Briseis or Chryseis, either. I mean, this is human trafficking. Yeah. And at the end of the day, it's not whether Briseis should be someone's slave in this way. Mm-hmm. The question is, who's right in asserting their leverage and their power?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think when you get to the Odyssey, and the first time you actually see Odysseus, he's sitting on the beach weeping. Why? He wants to go home. He can't go home. He's being held captive by a much more powerful being who is using him as a lover. And the incredible inversion of the Iliad.
Yeah.
The idea that you would do that to a male hero in this ethos of male power, different kinds of male power, right? Feats of arms, feats of strategy, 1,000 ships. We're getting that woman back.
Yeah.
And Odysseus finds himself all alone with a mast in his arms. And where does he end up? He's stuck. Yeah. He's a lot like Briseis.
Yeah. That's real. I've never thought of that. That's a really cool connection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's really neat.
I have to think about that more. That's really cool.
That's a really subtle point. But what do you make of that, Chris? Why is that crucial?
I think Homer, we tend to read Homer the first run as having a particular Greek pagan martial worldview.
Right.
Granted. That's the milieu that he's working within, right? Okay, all right. Sure. Pile of bodies outside the palace in Ithaca, right? Nothing changes. But at the same time, I think pretty consistently there are these crazy moments, if you have eyes to see them, where Helen, for instance, says, "Oh, what have I done? Brought this whole thing upon me." It's in the Iliad. It's in when Telemachus goes to visit Menelaus.
Right.
Yeah.
And she's and then Odysseus himself, sort of questioning the ethics. He's not quite to is it right or wrong, but man, that was dumb, maybe.
Yeah.
At certain moments. And then you've got even the suitors, I should say the suitors' parents, the suitors' fathers, are saying, this guy takes all our people off and gets them killed.
Yeah.
Maybe that is the suitors. I'm forgetting who says that. It's easy to say, well, those are bad guys. But Homer allows them to speak the truth about certain things while also being an abysmal example of the virtue of hospitality. So, they also get to say these things that aren't wrong.
Yeah, right.
And so I think that the transgressive aspect of it, not to get too Derrida with this, but the text is at odds with itself.
Yeah.
In all these, and that's what's so exciting about it, is that it's not, this isn't a one size fits all, or this is how to be Greek, and granted, lots of Greek boys knew this and that was how to be Greek, but as with the Bible or as with other foundational texts, there's so much, maybe contradiction's too strong, juxtaposition of different approaches to the question, right?
Yeah.
I love
You're completely right. I mean, Jay, you've kind of said this in many different ways. I mean, in a way, it's, Derrida is getting Homeric. You find
That's
out
the
that
hot
he
take.
was already there. It's
This
not
is
a
all too
Freudian read.
logocentric for me. I'm leaving. No, I'm kidding.
Hey, Homer's already there with you. He got sick of it too. He left it. What multicultural sort of values want to have. I think it's for our own idiom now. It's DEI. It's the diversity, the sort of equity, the inclusiveness. If you take those words out of our particular political context, that's Homer's got a lot of that. A lot of strange upending, upside downing, pointing the camera. I think Jay, you said this a lot in the corners. In the people who are the unimportant people, the people who don't matter.
Euroclea being very heroic at times. She's literally a thing. I'm still really interested in your Briseis Odysseus comment. And I wonder if part of why that's important is that this is a universe where everybody is a single loss away from being someone else's property.
Yeah. Right.
For dinner.
Yeah.
Or worse.
Property for dinner.
Talk about taking advantage
little
of
tartar.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think too, just dovetailing off what you're saying, Christopher, and I'm beginning to think, and this could be erroneous, but I'm beginning to think part of epic DNA, the Commedia, maybe not. I'm not sure. I have to read that again. I haven't read it in a long time. But I'm thinking of the Iliad, the Odyssey, Paradise Lost, and Beowulf particularly are all books that seem to have early on a very clear sense of its own significant definitions of things, whether it's what a good life is, what a good man is, whatever. Yeah. But then they each seem to interrogate that in fascinating ways. And I feel like it's often the drama of the interrogation is the key conflict and not so much a clean solution. I mean, piety is literally impossible. The gods don't agree. Plato taught us that. So that's part of the inherent problem of the Homeric landscape. But we see it at the very end of Beowulf. And I'm fascinated by the fact that, like, I so agree with what you said about how we can look at these as these, like, overly discrete little simple syllogisms in dactylic hexameter. And oh my gosh, it's not that. No. I mean, any neat conclusion, that would be an interesting topic. Here are, like, neat conclusions often said. Write about them. Interrogate the neat conclusion. Because, man, like, I appreciate just the complete lack of euphemism. And I recently read Emily Wilson's translation of the Iliad this summer. The complete lack of euphemism, right? And then in the Odyssey, just like every kind of human experience lives here in a raw, unadulterated way. Yeah. And I think students on some level, they might not say that, but I think there's an appreciation of, we're just saying what, they have I mentioned in another place, the Greeks had a word for, like, the sound a corpse makes when it hits the ground. We're not pretending it's something else. Like, it's that. That's what that sounds like,
Right. And our students are so off kilter with books like these because whatever their ears are tuned to hear, whatever their biases from their own particular culture, their own particular family group, religious backgrounds or not, they can't hear them in these texts. They can't orient themselves or ground themselves as they've been taught to do, either passively or actively. They can't be the little activist, fundamentalist, whatever, that they've learned to be in these texts. They're completely lost. And I love it. I love it for that because you have a chance of bringing, a real kid, a real reaction, real thoughts.
But even there's a tension. I mean, just to push a little, I think you're completely right. So there's this foreignness, but then right away in the first couple of chapters, how do we know Telemachus is a boy? Because book one ends with him getting tucked in. How do we know Telemachus is a boy? Because he says dumb adolescent crap to his adult mother, and only boys do that. Men know how to talk to people. You know what I mean? So there are these super universal moments and super particular moments happening concurrently.
Yeah.
So when later on he says, Athena says, put off the boy. And later on he says, the boy ain't here anymore.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, mother.
Yeah.
That's right. I'm gone. Yeah.
We're on book 22, for God's sake, Mom. Give me a break now.
Yeah. And it's this shocking thing that makes, I think the books sometimes get tagged as being elitist. And I think there's a tiny bit of confusion there in that they're elitist only in the sense that they're wanted by the elite, like people who recognize good things, who've been exposed to them, recognize them as good in ways you can't suspect. And unlike other good things, like really expensive food or private flights to islands and things like this is free. Everyone can have one of these for the cost of shipping, which is $3.99, at Amazon. You can save that up, a little bake sale
Mhm.
in your own neighborhood. You can come up with $3.99, and you
Yeah.
can get that book and you can have this experience. So
Yep.
it's the best kind of elitist. Well, we got to wrap
Well,
this
and
up.
back to C.S. Lewis too,
Go
when
ahead,
he
go ahead.
says,
No, go ahead.
see, the other thing I really like about that intro that C.S. Lewis does is that he says reading about Platonism it's a Herculean task. Reading philosophers or teachers of philosophy talk about the philosophy of Plato. That's tough. But reading the Apology isn't.
Oh.
Reading the Republic isn't. Reading Homer isn't. As long as you can have a little bit of a primer on what reading poetry and long poetry looks like.
Yeah.
You do that, quick
The
intro.
tiniest bit. Yeah.
It's easier than it's made out to be with these kinds of texts. Now,
That's
Shakespeare,
right.
different story, as Jay was saying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is tough. But with this, especially with Fagels or
Yeah.
it's accessible.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's almost an immediate pleasure. There's a very, very low bar to get into it with a little bit of guidance. And you always need a little bit of guidance. But yeah, the Apology will just about make you cry. It's so accessible to students. Well, it's a good point. It's a surprising point. That is a subtlety of it. That is one of the other subtleties of the text that makes it great. Well, let's round it out then, and we'll close off with our final question. Jay, sorry, Christopher, I mean to say, after these 23 years of teaching the book and more now in the college context, I don't know. What's your lingering question? What's a question that bothers you about the Iliad, the Odyssey? Jay and I talked about this. We have questions. I've had these questions for years that I refuse to look up because I've enjoyed the pleasure of reading it and thinking about it. Yeah, and just sitting on that little egg, until it has. And I don't want to know what other people think about it.
Right.
I don't know.
Right.
Do you have any lingering sort of questions or awesomeness, from this you want to point out?
As far as lingering awesomeness, so, what is awe-inspiring about it? I am never, and this goes for both Iliad and Odyssey, I am never without awe at the juggling of a handful of themes in such a powerful way, where we're moving through these themes and different characters, different creatures, different backstories, different we're all over the place, and yet we're doing the same thing throughout both texts. They're different flavors without question, but in the Iliad, just one way of thinking about it is that we're dealing with the madness that came upon Agamemnon, which is really the madness that came upon Achilles. Again, Athena's like us. But how do you take the madness down? How do you satiate the anger in that great Pixar movie where anger is taken over?
I know.
How do you bring anger down? And the relenting. Stop dragging that body around. Start giving it to dad. His dad.
How do you stop a cycle of violence? Both books wrestle with that.
Yeah, and it's working its way all the way through the Iliad in so many different ways.
Yeah.
And then even the Odyssey continues some of that too. Better forever to stay and be a farmer than to have done that short glorious thing. And I think with the Odyssey, it's the same. You're dealing with hospitality. You're dealing with fathers and sons. You're dealing with what does it mean to be home. You're dealing with kind of the inability to let go of the first half of life, man. That has to be put aside. Also, the boy has to be put aside to become the first half of life, man, because we need those too.
Right.
And also I'm so blown away by the trickery theme that goes all the way through all the stories that he tells, and they're all sort of semi-based on what quote unquote happened, but what we say happened, what has become our sort of base mythology about all that stuff is just what he tells the Phaeacians. Even that, who we don't even know, we don't know, but we trust it because it's 4 books long. But
the longest lie in the whole book.
We shouldn't. It might be the longest lie in the whole book. We don't really know. And I tend to go with it that's sort of what happened. but I think that's just because that's the tradition, but it's not locked in. So yeah, and when is he going to finally tell the truth? And is he going to tell the truth to Telemachus? Is he going to tell the truth to Penelope? Is he going to tell the truth to Laertes in the end, the very end? Like first he tries to trick him again.
I know. Well, there's no reason, none.
Seamlessly.
But it's so ingrained.
It's part of who he is. Yeah.
He's raised his oar, but he's still that guy.
Yeah.
Right.
You're like, come on. And so that's my awe. My awe is how did you, it's like, like a dryer cycle. It's just going around and around and around and around and until it stops. And I have this fulsome picture of it. Right. So that's powerful. In terms of questions, like lingering questions. There's so much that we take for granted about classic texts, and I should say texts of antiquity. We are warned by classicists, that we should assume that a third or half of what we say about this stuff is wrong. And I think that's probably right.
Right.
Right. Our Anglo-American reading is profoundly flawed. So I have all kinds of questions about what am I getting wrong?
Yeah.
Right.
But I can't necessarily get answers to that. So there's things that I want to know. And then there's the authorial question, which for some authors is, it's very obvious what Virginia Woolf thinks at times and what James Baldwin thinks at times because it's so overt, but it's not as obvious with these texts. And so is he drawing attention to the inherent ethical problem with the Chryseis business?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know, but I think it's pretty fun to pull it out of the text, right?
Right.
I think that's a subtle thing.
Yeah.
But I'd love to know the authorial mind. But this goes for all the ancient stuff. It's what is Aeschylus trying to do? Keep an audience awake.
Yeah.
And some other things. So that's tricky because I don't know what keeps a classical century audience awake very well. I don't think anybody does.
Entirely.
Yep.
Those are good. Those are good. Jay ended up hitting on things I know that has kind of kept us awake in these books and made us reflect as well that are big issues. Well, Christopher, that was an excellent reflection. I know to have you pull together so many thoughts, so many classes and reflections of teaching Homer and texts, epic texts, and to give us a little slice of that. I hope people listening find it encouraging and invigorating and make them want to have their own experience of trying this in class. And I think that might be a nice takeaway. You've heard reasoning, you've heard talk, but just go try it, go try it at whatever level you think you can get away with it and see what happens. It's a nice way to approach it. Well, thank you for your insights. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. That was fantastic to hear. And it's exactly the sort of thing Jay and I were hoping to pull out of a teacher like yourself. And I hope you're, I hope you're really socking it too. These UNH students, they ought to have been doing all this work when they were high school kids. Don't let them off the hook.
Hey, remember, live free or die is on all the license plates. You could be as harsh as you want.
That's so true.
George Carlin said, "Don't trust a state that has death right on the license plate." So you can go hard now.
All right. It's a strange mix up here. You'd think it was pure libertarian, but it really isn't.
Yeah, maybe not. Right.
Paul, my stepfather's family's from way up north in Maine, and Paul's family's from the same area.
Yeah,
that's right. Paul's line, which is one of my favorites, and I quote you, Paul, all the time, is the more north you go, the more south you get.
That says it all.
I found great.
I'm in southern New Hampshire.
Yes. Southern New Hampshire.
It's been such a pleasure, Jay. Thank you so much.
Really great chatting with you. Really great.
Yeah. Great chatting. Great to have you with us, and maybe we'll see you again sometime.
Yeah. Thanks, Christopher.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.